25 years ago, way back in the last century, Turner Pictures released the movie Michael. Maybe you remember it. The movie tells the story of two reporters, William Hurt and Robert Pastorelli, who travel to a small town in Iowa with an angel expert played by Andy McDowell in order to investigate reports of an angel who has taken up residence there. When they meet the angel, Michael, played by John Travolta, he turns out to be a cigarette-smoking, boxer-wearing, sugar-addicted, overweight, unshaven guy with wings, the kind that don't detach. And each begins asking Michael questions based on their preconception of an angel. And after trying to respond to many of their questions, Michael finally shrugs his shoulders, shakes his head, and responds, "I'm not that kind of an angel." No kidding. Just like those dubious investigators who could not accept the image of the angel in front of them, our preconceptions and limited perceptions may likewise make us skeptical of the portrayal in our liturgy of Michael's boss. You know, the big guy, the head honcho, Adonai, Elohim, judge, ruler of the universe, Avinu Malkeinu, Yud He Vav He, God. And I get it. Many of the images we're asked to accept, like that of judge of life and death, determiner of our fate, in the Unatana Tokef, which is such a significant part of the liturgy of this season, may be quite problematic. Many find their path through the high holidays blocked by an off-putting array of theological images. For them, and perhaps for you, that is simply the end of the journey. The moment we run up against an image of God that doesn't work, we may reply, "Not my kind of God," and just give up on the whole God thing. Perhaps it is when a childhood image of God no longer works for us, or in a moment of exceptional personal struggle. Where were you, God? I can't tell you how often over the course of my career someone has approached me and said, "Rabbi, I have to make a confession. I don't believe in God." "Tell me about the God you don't believe in," I ask. And when they do, 9 times out of 10, my response is, "Yeah, that's not my kind of God either." In fact, there are many images of God to which we likely can all respond in unison, "Not my kind of God." Images of God that simply fall outside the boundaries of Jewish faith, for instance. Or a God who loves some of humanity more than others? Or a God who demands absolute loyalty, wreaking havoc on those who fall out of line for even the most minor of infractions? Or a God of whom we can only say, "It's just beyond our limited understanding. These are just not my kind of God." And we probably feel ourselves comfortably distant from much of this kind of thinking, but just how far from it are we really when we ask in times of personal angst and despair, "Why are you punishing me, God? Where are you?" Questions many of us may be asking in this very, very difficult moment. When we try to find some answer for God's invoking pandemics, burning down the West Coast, causing earthquakes, or allowing for civil unrest, we are regressing into a kind of fundamentalist thinking that in our more rational moments, we would probably all agree is just not our kind of God. The God of my childhood, of my bar mitzvah, or even the God I wrote a theology paper about in seminary are also no longer my kind of God. Neither is Father or King or a God of any gender, color, sex that would suggests that some of us are created more in God's image than others. Heck, there are a lot of ways God is portrayed to which I also say, not my kind of God. But that doesn't have to be the end of the journey. Not surprisingly, I am a flag-waving believer in God. So tonight, as we enter the High Holy Days drama once again, I want to tell you it's okay to say, that's not my kind of God. As long as that is the starting place for a search to find the God of whom you can say, now this is my kind of God. Tonight I want to share with you just a bit about my kind of God, because I believe that the way we choose to think about God, or not, profoundly impacts how we understand who we are and how we respond to the world around us. As a starting place, and you may not know it, but saying, not my God, places you in very good company. No less than the great Rabbi, doctor, and philosopher Moses Maimonides taught 1,000 years ago that when it comes to describing God, the most we can do is to talk about what God is not. God is not Him, not Father, not Redeemer, not Shekhinah, not Helper, not Healer. Because God is not any one thing. Our descriptions of God are human attempts to define the undefinable. After all, how are finite beings like us to understand no less to describe the infinite? All of our definitions are all of our definitions are limited and incomplete. The moment we try to define God as something, we put God in a box. Now think about that for a moment. We hate that when it's done to us, don't we? When we are objectified and labeled, we protest, that's not me. Or at least that's not all of me. And you can imagine God responding similarly, I'm not that kind of God. I'm pretty sure that is why we have the second commandment in the first place. You shall not make any engraved images or any likenesses. But there is one thing we can affirmatively say about God. God is. Not followed by an ellipsis, but by a period. God is. Period. Maimonides said just that, and so do we each time we sing his words in Adon Olam. Hu haya v'hu hoveh v'hu yiyeh b'tifara. God was, God is, God will be. Here, Maimonides is riffing on the Hebrew symbol for God, Yud He Vav He, the unpronounceable word we read as Adonai. Yud He Vav He is a conflation into one symbol of the past, present, and future conjugations of the verb to be. God is. Or more accurately, God was, is, will be. This is God's cryptic message to Moses at the burning bush. You'll recall that having been asked by God to take on the mission of freeing the Israelites, Moses expresses his doubts. How will the Israelites know that I am just not some lunatic, he asks. Who should I say has sent me on this crazy task? God mysteriously replies, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. Tell them Eheyeh sent you. Eheyeh asher eheyeh. That is, I will be what I will be. Tell them I will be what I will be sent you. What? I will be a source of courage when you face Pharaoh. I will be a source of compassion when you face those in need. I will be a source of wisdom as you lead your people, and I will be a source of strength as you face a pandemic. I will be a source of comfort in your time of healing. Eheyeh asher eheyeh. God is a verb. A verb. God is being. Of course, that shouldn't be too much of a surprise to us because so are we, human beings. Or perhaps more hopefully on this day of creation and new beginnings, we are human becomings. That is the first thing we learn about our humanity, that we were created b'Tselem Elohim, in the image of a continually evolving, growing, changing, and becoming God. We, like God, are, is, and will be. Now here's why all of this matters. Because none of this is really about God at all. God doesn't need to know about God. We do. We do. To say that I am created in the image of an ever-evolving God is an aspirational message. My commitment to the idea of Tselem Elohim means I'm not done yet. I am called upon to be a partner with God, obligated to acts of love, of healing and justice, through which God's presence becomes a reality in our world. When I say I am created in God's image, I am acknowledging that for all I have become, for all that I have done, there's still more work to do in order to more ever become closer to that divine image. Now, this is certainly not my God alone. This is also the God of Isaiah, who will remind us on Yom Kippur morning that God is much more interested in our acts of love and justice than in our prayers. You see, for my kind of God, it is not my relationship with God that is most important, but rather my relationship with all those who are also created in God's image. My kind of God puts humanity at the center. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that in an egotistical, it's all about me way. What I do mean is that when push comes to shove, when it is a matter of priorities, for my God, concern for humanity precedes ritual acts through which I express my devotion to God. This isn't a new idea. In the Talmud, we find rabbis teaching just this. For instance, when there is only enough money for oil to light either household lights or Hanukkah lights, we are told that the comfort of the household takes precedence over the proclamation of God's miracle. Humanity first. Similarly, when a burial conflicts with the reading of the Purim Megillah, the respect for the mourners takes precedence over the proclamation of God's miraculous victory in Shushan. Divine beings take precedence over the divine. And what is it that we are instructed regarding the priorities in asking and granting forgiveness on these days? Humanity first. We must ask and grant forgiveness to each other before asking forgiveness of God. And perhaps the most revolutionary teaching of all in this regard is that of Rabbi Hillel. You likely know it well. When asked to teach the Torah while standing on one foot, he responds, "What is hateful to you, do not do to another." Now think about this for a minute. One of the greatest rabbis ever, when asked to teach about Judaism, does not choose a line of Torah. He could have quoted the passage from Leviticus that we will read on Yom Kippur. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. In fact, Hillel is often misquoted as having said just this, but that's not what he said. Hillel purposefully avoids a particular Jewish reference in order to make the message more universal for his non-Jewish challenger. But more than that, he leaves God out completely. What does Hillel teach is the underlying principle of Torah. Not obey God, but treat every human the way you want to be treated. That is quite astounding, actually. For me, God is part of the equation. First, God is the role model to which I aspire. Selam Elohim. And second, my personal theology challenges me to see every other human being as created in God's image and filled with godly potential. Now, whether they choose to act on that godly potential, as we are reminded during these days, is up to us. The choice, ultimately, is ours. So when I read Unatana Tokef, I'm not put off by the image of God depicted there. What I see is a poetic reminder that there is only so much I can control. And what is that? Well, I can control my moral awareness. This is the purpose of prayer. I can reorient my actions to better reflect the divine within me. This is repentance. And I can choose to pursue that which is just. That is tzedakah. Tefillah, prayer. Teshuvah, repentance, and tzedakah, the pursuit of justice. 3 categories of human behavior identified at the end of the Unatana Tokef, through which I can choose to act upon the divine image within me, and in so doing, bring God's presence to life in this world. By the end of the film, the minds and hearts of the protagonists have been opened, their perceptions broadened, as they come to realize that Michael really is an angel. They also come to realize that their understandings and experiences are indeed very limited. More importantly, through their experience, they discover something within them that they had previously been unable to see. This, in the end, was the purpose of Michael's visit in the first place: to challenge their beliefs, tefillah, to force them to look within, teshuvah, and to reevaluate and act differently in the world, tzedakah. Now, isn't that the purpose of these days? As we face challenging and even uncomfortable images, we too are challenged to acknowledge our own limited perspectives and understandings. Our task is to allow the prayers and reflections of these days to open our hearts and unfetter the chains that have limited the possibilities of our own lives, freeing ourselves to grow, to change, and to continue to evolve. These days challenge us to liberate the divine character within us, that we might realize and fulfill our God-given potential. After all, ultimately, we are asked to serve as God's messengers. God's presence and power is enacted through us. So when you next look in the mirror and see staring back a person who may be a little too scraggly, and maybe who likes sugar and caffeine just a bit too much, be assured that you are standing face to face with one of God's angels. L'shana Tovah and Shabbat Shalom. May it be for all of us a good and sweet new year.